The Light Brigade, having been embarrassed repeatedly in front of the British Army, finally gets its chance to prove themselves at the Battle of Bo Cova. After receiving poorly written orders, they ran into the mouth of hell itself in a charge that will take them from the battlefields to the history books and on into myth and legend, in no small part thanks to Alistair Tenpenny's epic poem, Ode to a Pony's Behind. Oh, wait, hold on. Wrong notes. The epic poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. Hello, and welcome to History's a Disaster. I'm your host, Andrew, and tonight we are continuing our look into the events surrounding the charge of the Light Brigade. Okay, now, first off, I want to note that I know the poet's name was really Alfred Lord Tennyson, and the poem was extremely popular in England ever since it was released days after the charge took place. But I mean, come on, we all know The Trooper by Iron Maiden, the best song by the greatest heavy metal band in the world, is much better than a poem by some long dead guy. But I digress. Last week, we left off with the British finishing up their defensive line with the redoubts in place called the Causeway Heights. Tonight, we're going to pick back up with the opening shots of the siege of Sevastopol. So, let's get into it. By the morning of October 17th, 1854, the siege guns were in place on the heights overlooking Sevastopol, and they began their deadly work. The British grew excited, knowing the end was near. Within a few days, the defenses would be rubble and the attack could begin. By the end of the day, the defenses were trashed, but by morning, they were back again better than before. And, as if they were stuck in some sort of Looney Tunes cartoon, this pattern would persist for 3 days. They'd knock them down, and the Russians would rebuild better. Lord Raglan fucked up by not attacking immediately. A Russian army engineer, Lieutenant Colonel Franz Toddlebean, used this to his advantage. He used the entire population of Sevastopol, working in shifts, to build and reinforce the southern defenses, reinforcing them with earthworks and naval guns from the Black Sea Fleet. Their quick work outpaced the destruction brought by the siege guns. During the siege, Russian patrols were crossing the river and keeping the cavalry on high alert throughout the night. Tensions were growing among the men. False alerts and Russian feints had them on edge. The men were getting exhausted, with many hitting the sick tent, putting more pressure on the remainder. On the night of October 21st, a report came in of a Russian force of 20,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry advancing across the Chernaya River towards Bo Cova. Lord Lucan, fearing this was the expected attack, took the entire cavalry division out to meet the enemy. Lord Raglan ordered an infantry division from the Sevastopol Heights down to reinforce the defenses. They stood out all night in the coldest night of the campaign so far, without even a hint of a Russian nearby. When morning came, the infantry marched back up to the heights. Everyone was bitterly cold and exhausted. Major Augustus Willett, the commander of the 17th Lancers, would be the only casualty that night. He would die the next day in a cruel twist of irony from cholera brought on by exposure. Willett had considered the cavalry cloak an unneeded article of clothing and refused to wear it or allow his men to wear it, no matter how cold it was. On the afternoon of that next day, another alert was sounded, and the cavalry spent another bitter night waiting for an attack that never came. The Russians were wearing down the British without having to fire a shot. On the night of October 24th, a Turkish spy returned with information on the Russian army that had staged just beyond the Chernaya and would attack in the morning. The attack force included 25,000 infantry, 3,400 cavalry, and 2,300 artillerymen with 78 artillery guns. Lord Raglan ignored this along with other intelligence reports about Russian reinforcements having arrived in the area. He believed all this to be fake and nothing more than false alarms to weaken his defenses around Sevastopol, so he did nothing to reinforce the defensive screen at Kadikoy. The Russian attack began at 5 a.m. the next morning. The outlying pickets began to signal of a massive incoming enemy force of infantry and cavalry. The Light Brigade near the Causeway Heights saddled up in preparation of the enemy advance as the first Russian artillery shells bombarded the redoubts on the heights. The battle had begun. At 6 a.m., Lord Paget took command of the Light Brigade since Cardigan was still out on his yacht. Paget and the regimental officers prepared the cavalry for battle, yelling last-minute instructions to the men. Lord Lucan rode quickly toward Kadikoy to meet Sir Campbell and discuss the coming attack, both men agreeing this was not another feint, but an attack in force meant to take the base. They sent messages to Raglan to that effect and then went their separate ways back to their men. Lucan left the Light Brigade in place and advanced with the Heavy Brigade towards the redoubts. Not wishing to engage such a large force, Lucan positioned the Heavy Brigade behind the redoubts in a stupid attempt to try to discourage the Russians from advancing further. He placed the brigade in such a position that before long, the Russian artillery that overshot the redoubts smashed into the ranks of the Heavy Brigade. They lost 7 horses and 2 men before he pulled the brigade back into position next to the Light Brigade. Everyone assumed further support was coming. However, it would take nearly 2 hours that they didn't have for infantry support to march down from the Sevastopol heights. The Turks were left alone in the redoubts to take the full force of the Russian attack. The first redoubt fell at 7:30. 500 Turks defending the most exposed redoubt took a heavy artillery barrage. The Russian guns had a greater range than the Turks. They could not respond back. Their 12-pound guns could not match the Russian 18-pounders. The barrage was followed up with an infantry assault of at least 2,500 Russians. 170 Turks would fall before Russian bayonets before the rest retreated. The Light Brigade had to sit helplessly as the Turks were chased down and slaughtered. Lord Lucan again refused to move out to meet the enemy. He would blame Raglan for the lack of support in that preserving the cavalry was necessary for the defense of Bo Cova. The Turks in the other redoubts watched as the first fell. They were alone and outnumbered, and when they saw no British support was coming, started to retreat. Despite what later reports would say, the Turks fought hard whenever they could. They did not shamelessly retreat after only a few shots were fired. With the redoubts now in Russian hands, the artillery and the guns in the redoubts swung towards the nearest British unit, the Light Brigade. It wasn't long before they started taking casualties. It wasn't till nearly 7:45 that Cardigan arrived to take command of the Light Brigade. At roughly the same time, Lord Raglan, along with war correspondent William Russell, would take the Sapling Heights, 650 feet above the Balaclava Plains, to take command of the battle. From the heights, they could clearly see the valleys that cut across the plains, along with the deployment of all the British forces. Lieutenant Somerset Calthorpe and Captain Nolan, along with several other staffers, stood by on their horses, ready to take off with any orders from Raglan quickly to the commanders on the field below. Raglan had initially believed the Russian attack was a feint to draw his men out so infantry from Sevastopol could swarm out of the city and hit his units on the heights overlooking them. Now he realized how badly he fucked up. All that stood between the massive Russian army and Balaclava was the 93rd Highlanders and the surviving Turks that had rallied alongside them. Their only support was the cavalry division. He sent out orders for 2 infantry divisions to march down from the heights. They would take 2 hours to arrive, but the Russians had the army to take Balaclava in much less time. Lord Lucan had at this time positioned the cavalry in a prime position to hit the Russians in the flank when they moved on the Highlanders. However, Raglan did not want to use the cavalry in such an action until the infantry arrived. He sent out his first order to the cavalry division at 8 a.m. Cavalry to take ground to the left of the second line of redoubts occupied by the Turks. Lucan was pissed. He was being ordered to withdraw again. This move would leave the 550 Highlanders and the remaining Turks to face the coming Russian onslaught alone without any support. Lucan wisely ordered the staff officer who brought the order to remain until the movement was complete so that there was no misunderstanding on what he was to do, which was smart because this order made no sense. I at first thought I had misread something somewhere, but nope. There was no second line of redoubts, and what exactly he meant by this, no one really knows. Although Lucan did manage to interpret the order correctly, and that take ground to the left meant move the cavalry to the west. This put the Light Brigade near the mouth of the North Valley in an area where they could not be seen or engaged by the Russians. Raglan watched the cavalry move into position. 30 minutes after he originally gave the order, he then changed his mind. He figured, since the Turks had initially held their ground until they saw the cavalry fall back, that they might break and run again with the cavalry being withdrawn. So he issued a second order to the cavalry at 8:30. 8 squadrons of heavy dragoons to be detached toward Balaclava to support the Turks who are wavering. There was no evidence that the Turks were wavering at this time. Only what Raglan thought they might do. Also, each regiment in the brigade consisted of 2 squadrons. So, Lord Lucan was required to send 4 of his 5 regiments from the heavy brigade back to the defensive line around Katakoy. This pissed off Lucan since it made no sense. Having received this order just 20 minutes after taking up the new position, he was now being forced to divide the cavalry, separating them by about a mile and thus reducing the effectiveness of either unit. At roughly 9:15, the Russian cavalry advanced unseen partway up the North Valley before separating into two groups and heading straight up over the causeway heights, heading directly towards Bo Cova. The first group, consisting of a force of 400 cavalry, headed straight for the 93rd Highlanders and the Turks. The main body advanced a little further before turning to attack the line too. However, when they hit the crest of the hill, they saw the 4 heavy brigade regiments passing below them. The Highlanders and Turks were prepared for the coming attack. If they could not break the attack with rifle and musket fire, they were ready with bayonets fixed. They also had a few artillery on their flanks for support. As the Russian cavalry picked up speed towards them, Sir Campbell rode along the thin red line, shouting to his men, "Men, remember, there is no retreat from here. You must die where you stand." The cavalry charged the thin line atop the hill. Grape and canister shot from the artillery tore through the Russian charge. The Highlanders fired their first volley too early and failed to hit a Russian, but the charge was turned. The Russians wheeled away before turning around to charge again. The Highlanders fired a second volley to a more devastating effect and caused the Russians to turn again. The Highlanders cheered as they turned, but the Russians wheeled about again and dashed at the line. A third volley was fired, and the Russian charge was broken. They stopped, dead in their tracks, before retreating. British round shot chased them over the hills the way they came. The Highlanders cheered even louder. They had broken the only enemy charge of the day with fewer men than would normally be called for. While the Highlanders fought their battle, the second group of Russians topped the causeway heights and spotted the heavy brigade. Both groups were surprised at this chance meeting. General Scarlett shouted the order to turn the 2 forward regiments into a single line facing the enemy. The 2 rear regiments would move forward and turn, forming a second line behind the first. The Russians had the British severely outnumbered, with troop estimates from 1,500 cavalry up to 3,500. The British were only 800 strong. Despite this advantage, and the advantage of having the high ground, the Russian forces froze at this chance encounter. General Scarlett did not hesitate. He ordered the advance. The Russians still had not moved. When the distance was down to 50 yards between the 2 opposing cavalry units, the unit's trumpeter sounded the charge. The heavy brigade dug in their spurs and pushed harder uphill. By this time, the Russians had recovered and raced downhill to meet them. The 2 cavalry units came to a standstill when they met. The British fought hard against the superior number of Russians. Sabers swung through the air in every direction. Pistols fired. Men screamed as limbs were lost. Some fell silently as heads were severed. The British had the advantage with the horses as they pressed into the Russian cavalry. They used this to great effect to run the Russians down. However, being dismounted was an almost guaranteed death sentence. But soon the Russians broke and turned. The British pursued for a few hundred yards, cutting down even more Russians. The British were called off the pursuit, and when some Russian officers attempted to rally the men atop the heights, they were quickly dissuaded of this when the horse artillery opened up with their 24-pounders. Round shot and exploding shell flew over the heads of the heavy brigade and right into the Russians gathered at the top of the heights. The survivors quickly withdrew. The Light Brigade was disappointed and bitter when the order to chase down the Russians never came. They were in a perfect position to do so and could have possibly brought the battle to a close much sooner. However, Cardigan refused to budge. He would later blame it on orders from Lucan not to move. Lucan would later lay the blame on Cardigan. Either way, the Light Brigade was pissed. They did nothing but watch. It was now 9:30, and the British successes had opened up the possibility of a counterattack to reclaim the Causeway Heights and bring this battle to an end. The British infantry units should have been arriving shortly, but there was no sign of them. The commander of the infantry, General George Cathcart, had not treated the orders received by Raglan with any sense of urgency. He had decided his breakfast was more important and waited a full 30 minutes before issuing the order for the infantry to march down to the plains. By 9:45, when they still had not arrived, General Airey was sent out to hurry them up and to tell them they were to immediately attack the Causeway Heights and retake the redoubts. Every minute passed was more time for the Russians to prepare for the counterattack they had to know was coming. The Russian cavalry had regrouped at the far end of the North Valley behind 8 Don Cossack artillery guns and more artillery positions on either side of the valley on the high ground. Lord Raglan believed a further show of force would persuade the Russians to abandon the Causeway Heights. To this effect, he issued a third, let's say, less than clear order to the cavalry at 10 a.m. Cavalry to advance and take advantage of any opportunity to recover the heights. They will be supported by infantry which have been ordered. Advance on 2 fronts. Raglan wanted the cavalry to advance immediately and the infantry would arrive later. Lucan interpreted the order as wait for the infantry and advance with them. Since the Causeway Heights ran down the high ground between the two valleys, Lucan moved the Light Brigade to the entrance of the North Valley and the Heavy Brigade to the entrance of the South Valley, suggesting this was his response to the order to attack on 2 fronts. He had now complied with what he believed the order to be and waited for the infantry to move in to support, and can't really fault him for his interpretation here. During the entire campaign, Raglan had refused to allow the cavalry to do anything without infantry support. How was he to guess he was now being ordered to attack a heavily fortified position with only the possibility of support later? Lord Cardigan waited with the Light Brigade in the North Valley. The valley was flat and unobstructed, sloping slightly downward toward the Chernaya, which was just out of sight behind a bend in the valley. What could be seen was the enemy artillery battery 1¼ miles away on the other end of the valley. The Light Brigade watched as the Russians moved another battery up the slopes to the left and up the slopes on the right. Both batteries turned toward the brigade. While they waited, French cavalrymen of the Chasseurs d'Afrique formed up to the left of the brigade. Lord Raglan, watching from the Sapling Heights, was getting impatient. When General Airey arrived and informed him the infantry would be there within 20 minutes, he was pissed the cavalry was standing around. Some of them have even dismounted from their horses. While he was getting angry his orders were being ignored, someone called out that the Russians in the redoubts were dragging away the British guns. However, from the distance away they were, from the causeway, there is no way anyone could definitively say that's what was happening. Russian historians would claim this never happened. Either way, Raglan took this news hard. Losing artillery guns to the enemy was a sign of defeat, and he could not have that. His mentor and idol, the Duke of Wellington, had never lost a gun, and he was damn sure not going to lose any either. The infantry was still minutes away, and only the cavalry could move quick enough to stop the loss of the guns. He now issued a fourth order to the cavalry that was supposed to go along with the third order at 10:45. Cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent them from carrying away the guns. Troop horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry is on your left. Immediate. Lieutenant Calthorpe was next in line for duty and stepped forward to take the order. Raglan stopped him and ordered Captain Nolan to deliver it. Captain Nolan was one of the best horsemen in the army, and Raglan needed the order delivered immediately. Under normal conditions, an aide-de-camp carrying orders would read the order and request clarifications if the order was unclear. That way, if the commander receiving did not understand, the aide-de-camp could explain on Raglan's behalf. Lieutenant Calthorpe, being Raglan's aide-de-camp and nephew, knew what the order required, but in the heat of the moment, it was uncertain if Nolan received further instructions on the order. As Nolan turned to head out, Raglan called out to him, "Tell Lord Lucan the cavalry is to attack immediately." And with that, Nolan was on his way. It would take Nolan 15 minutes to reach the Light Brigade. At 11 a.m., he delivered the order to Lord Lucan. Lucan read the order and mounted his division. Reading the order again and not seeing anything that should connect it with the previous order took it to be new instructions. He failed to make the connection between the two sets of orders and failed to get clarification from Nolan. The hatred between the two men was palpable. Instead of a calm discussion about the orders, Lucan demanded to know what he was to attack and what guns. Nolan swept his arms across the valley and shouted back at Lucan, "There is your enemy. There is your guns." The hostility between the two men prevented any further discussion. Lucan took the wave of Nolan's arm to mean they were to attack the only guns visible from where they sat, the Russian battery on the opposite side of the valley. Instead of returning to the Sapling Heights like he should have, Nolan, eager for combat, asked the commander of the 17th Lancers if he could ride with them. Being a close friend of Nolan's, he agreed. Lucan turned away and approached Cardigan. The hostility between these two tempered by the formality of rank. After reading the order, Cardigan made objections since they would be racing past not one but two other gun positions. Lucan said that could not be helped, and that it was Raglan's order that they attack immediately. Both men, now believing they were being ordered to attack the guns at the end of the valley, knew what was to come. Heavy casualties and perhaps the loss of the entire brigade. Being over a mile away, the horses would not be able to sustain the pace of a charge. They would have to advance at a steady pace, and only when they got close to the guns could they go to the gallop and charge. The slow pace would keep them in sight of multiple cannons during the entire advance down the valley. But they could not back down. They had what they believed to be valid orders, and they had no choice but to obey them. The brigade formed up into three lines, with the 17th Lancers and 13th Light Dragoons in the first line, the 11th Hussars in the 2nd, and the 4th Light Dragoons and the 8th Hussars forming the 3rd line. This caused some tension between the two, since the 17th was Lucan's former regiment and the 11th was Cardigan's own. Whether this was meant as a slight or not, it should be noted the 17th Lancers were the only Lancer regiment, and it is normal for Lancer regiments to be at the head of the charge, since lances make for a terrifying sight when you're being charged. Lord Cardigan would leave Lord Pageant in charge of the 3rd line while he commanded the front. Each regiment formed up into 2 ranks, the 2nd rank half a horse behind the 1st. The men in each rank would ride knee to knee. Cavalry regulations demanded that the right knee of one rider should be exactly 6 inches from the left knee of the next rider. The cavalrymen eyed the distant battery, the guns on the high grounds, and the mass of cavalry and infantry gathered behind those guns. They believed they now faced the entire Russian army. Cardigan issued his first order to draw swords. All the regiments held their swords upright while the Lancers held their lances straight up and down, their red and white flags waving high overhead. Most of them used handkerchiefs to tie their sabers to their wrists so they would not lose them in the charge and fight to come. Despite knowing what was to come next, and that many of them would never leave this valley again, they would all follow Cardigan into hell if that was what was required of them. Lord Cardigan was determined to lead his men well and show nothing but courage. As the commander of the Light Brigade, he would lead the men from the front. He issued his second order with a strong voice. The brigade will advance. 1st Squadron of the 17th Lancers direct. This was more information than order. There would be no movement until the bugles called. The lead squad of the 17th would act as the squadron of direction. The front line of 2 regiments would be 140 yards wide for a total of 125 men. During the advance, it would be important that everyone went in the same direction at the same speed so they would hit the enemy together. Everyone would follow the 1st Squadron's speed and direction. The 1st Squadron would follow Lord Cardigan's example as he led the brigade. The whole cavalry division was to take part in the advance. Once the Light Brigade moved out, the Heavy Brigade would move forward after leaving a set distance between the 2 brigades. The advance began at precisely 11:10 a.m. Lord Cardigan issued the order, "Walk," to his trumpeter who sounded the order. Regimental trumpeteers took up the call up and down the line. As the order sounded, Lord Cardigan set off, followed by the 2 frontline regiments. The advance began at a pace of 4 miles per hour. When the clearance between the 2 lines became sufficient, Cardigan ordered trot. The cavalry increased its pace to 8 miles per hour. The 11th Hussars of the 2nd line followed behind at 100 yards. Not a word was spoken amongst the men. The only sound heard was the jingle of collar chains and an occasional horse making horsey noises. The most experienced of the men eyed the guns in the valley around them. They knew it would take them nearly 7 minutes at the trot to reach the enemy. 7 minutes on open ground with nothing between them and the waiting guns. They all hoped for a break in regulation and an increase in pace. Lord Cardigan, however, was a very by-the-books type. Regulations stated that the trot was to be held until within 250 yards of the enemy, and that was what Cardigan would hold them to. Some officers tried to force a quicker pace, but Cardigan held them back. It would not be long before they set out that the battery from the Russian 16th Artillery Brigade on the Federican Heights, directly across the valley from the Causeway Heights, they would have been the guns to the left of the Light Brigade, were given the order to fire. The Light Brigade at the mouth of the valley were just barely within range of their 12-pounder guns. They were the only battery within range of the brigade, and only the first-line regiments were under fire. When the first volley was fired, Captain Nolan had rushed ahead of the brigade, yelling and swinging his saber as he dashed from the left of the regiments toward the right. There are different accounts of why he ran so far ahead. He was 5 yards further ahead than Lord Cardigan. His reasons for this would be lost to history as the first volley landed 20 yards ahead of the brigade. Captain Nolan would be the first casualty of the advance when a fragment of exploded shell tore through his chest. The second-line regiments had not started their advance and had to watch as the Russians opened fire before they started their own. Now, with the front-line regiments 200 yards ahead of Lord Paget and his line, the cavalry advanced steadily. Then the Russian second volley exploded directly overhead. On the Sapling Heights, Raglan and his staff, along with war correspondent William Russell, watched the Russians' opening volley. None were surprised by this, as it was expected the brigade would take some fire before they turned right to advance up to the Causeway Heights. There were gasps of horror amongst those gathered as the cavalry did not make the turn and continued straight down the valley. They all knew what was about to come. The brigade would be hammered with intense and sustained fire all the way through the valley. As the shells and round shot tore gaps in the lines, the men were quickly ordered to close ranks and fill the gaps. It was important they maintained a tight formation when they hit the enemy line. The 11th Hussars, following behind the front line, soon came under devastating fire and took casualties. Lord Paget and the next line of regiments watched helplessly at the effects the cannons were having and knew it would be their turn soon to face the fire. As the second line continued forward, the Heavy Brigade waited for the proper interval before beginning their advance. They gripped their swords tightly as they waited for the order. The bugle sounded the command to walk, and Lord Lucan set off. Being the divisional commander, Lucan and his staff would ride ahead of the Heavy Brigade and act as a link between the Light and Heavy Brigades. General Scarlett waited the proper interval before leading the front regiments of the Heavy Brigade out. As the trumpeter sounded the trot, the regiments increased their pace. They met with the first bloody wounded men trying to make it back to the British lines. And then it was their turn as the Russian artillery fire slammed into the front ranks of the Heavy Brigade. Lord Lucan would be lightly wounded as his horse was shot twice. Others would not be so lucky as shells opened up holes in the lines. They were saved from even more casualties by the French. When the French saw the Light Brigade coming under fire from the guns on the Fedouin Heights, Major Abdellah led an attack partially concealed by tall scrubs. As soon as they were spotted, the Russians brought their muskets to bear on the French. Ignoring the fire, the French immediately charged the Russian position. This fourth cavalry charge of the day forced the Russians to load up their guns and drag them away. They had arrived in time to save the Heavy Brigade, but the damage to the Light Brigade had already been done. However, Lord Lucan lived up to his nickname. He sent out the order for the brigade to withdraw. This did not sit well with the men. The only thing worse than facing the incoming fire was the thought of abandoning the Light Brigade to their fate. Lord Cardigan and the Light Brigade were left without the support they thought followed behind them. He wrongly believed the Light Brigade would be completely wiped out. He was quoted as saying, "They have sacrificed the Light Brigade. They will not have the heavy if I can help it." At 11:13, the front-line regiments came within range of the Russian guns at the end of the valley. They were now halfway through the valley when round shot and shell from these guns tore through their ranks. Men fell to the left and right of the remaining riders. They were riding hell-bent to reach the Russian guns, covered in the blood of their fallen brothers. Lord Paget in the second line was facing difficulties of his own. The 8th Hussars kept drifting off course. He could not keep the regiments in line. The commander of the 8th was struggling to keep them in line, but they continued to drift further and further to the right. Lord Paget would give up trying so he could focus on what was ahead. At 11:14, in their desperation, men in the front line tried to force a quicker pace. They were closing in on the Russian guns and could see the cannonballs streaking from the muzzles of those guns. First, Captain Morris came alongside Lord Cardigan, who ordered him to remain steady. Then Captain White, the commander of the 17th Lancers' 1st Squadron, the one responsible for maintaining the proper interval between the brigade commander and the regiments, came alongside Cardigan. Cardigan laid his saber broadside against his chest and angrily yelled at him not to force the pace or ride alongside his commanding officer. The 11th Hussars, riding behind the 17th and somewhat safe from the artillery fire from the front, came alongside the Fedouin Heights. Now even with the Russian infantry that had gathered on the hill, the infantry poured volley after volley into the cavalry as they rode past. The wounded and dead fell from their horses. Riderless horses now dashed and galloped amongst the regiments, adding to the chaos. The survivors would be forever scarred by the sights of severed limbs, shattered arms hanging uselessly held on by shreds of skin and tendon, and brains exposed from shot and shell. Behind the 11th Hussars, the second line had completely split. The 8th Hussars had veered so far to the right they were now closer to the causeway heights. The Russian infantry on the slopes quickly targeting them as they rode past. At 11:15, the guns on the causeway heights opened up, ripping into the right flank of the regiment. The front line, now more than halfway down the valley, would be under fire from both batteries for the next 400 yards. The artillery would pour grape, canister, and shell into the Russian cavalry as the infantry continued their volleys of musket fire. The cavalry was taking heavy casualties. At 11:16, those on the Sapling Heights could do nothing but stare in disbelief. Lord Raglan could not believe his orders had come to this. The front line was 250 yards from the guns when Cardigan shouted the order. The bugle sounded the gallop, and pace was increased. When the smoke from the guns thinned, Cardigan spotted what he believed to be the center of the line and headed for it. He was trying to maximize the chances that the remaining regiments behind would hit the entire length of the gun line. In their eagerness, men of the 17th tried to press the pace, but Cardigan held them back again. The guns continued to fire. More men fell, and riderless horses continued to ride through the regiments. Those who had lost their horse attempted to catch one of them and continued the charge. Others took shelter behind the dead animals spread across the field. Dismounted men made easy pickings for the sharpshooters on the hills. 11:17. The Russian gun crews were firing at a rate of every 30 seconds. As soon as the smoke from their guns cleared, they could see the British advance before they fired again. As the British came closer, the effects of canister shot increased. Canister shot effectively turned the cannon into a large shotgun. At close range, the contents of the canister shot had a spread of 10 yards. Anything within that would be hit. As the cavalry closed in, some aimed for the gaps between the guns. It was safer there than riding directly toward the waiting muzzles. They were now less than 100 yards away. The cavalry was entering the smoke from the Russian guns. In a last-ditch effort to break the British charge, the gunners were ordered to ignore safety precautions in order to get one final volley in to break the charge when they were still 20 or 30 yards out. Lord Cardigan issued his final command. The bugle sounded the charge. It was not needed. Constant drill and practice had taught the men what they needed to know. They knew roughly when to go to the charge. Lances were lowered to the engaged position as they charged the guns. The Russian gunners began to panic. Fear that they could not break the charge swept through them. As Lord Cardigan reached the Russian line, the guns thundered one final time. Russian gunners dove under their guns to escape the coming lances. Some broke and ran. They did not get far before being given the point of a lance. The 11th Hussars, coming in behind them, had strayed too far to the left and came under heavy fire from the infantry on the Fedayeen heights as they made their run across the final few yards to the guns. The guns, now fallen silent, were completely hidden by the smoke, and since they had drifted too far to the left, most of the regiment missed the battery completely. Only those on the far right made it in amongst the guns. The survivors of the front-line regiments who had lost their horses now had another worry. In the smoke, they risked being trampled by the men of the following regiments as they charged through the smoke. Lord Paget and the 4th hit the guns just after the 11th. Every attempt was made to avoid the wounded that littered the ground. Those that could grabbed riderless horses from among the 4th to continue the attack. The 8th Hussars, who had now fallen behind and far to the right of the 4th, missed the gun line completely except for only a few on the far left. Troop Sergeant Henry Harrison stopped to help a wounded Private Pennington who was taking fire from Russian infantry. They were the last mounted men to cross the Russian gun line. The smoke from the guns had drifted behind them too. The dense smoke covered an area of 80 yards, almost all the way to the waiting Russian cavalry 100 yards behind the guns. When the survivors of the 17th Lancers and 13th Hussars broke through the gun line, they were enveloped in this thick cloud, surrounded by Russian gunners and horse teams. Visibility was extremely limited as the intense melee began. Screams of unseen, mortally wounded men filled the air as they were cut down. Some Russian gun crews tried desperately to save their guns, and 2 were eventually dragged off. Others chose to stand and fight. The survivors of the Light Brigade blamed the loss of so many men on the 200 members of the gun crews and took out their vengeance. They cut down those they could. Horse teams were shot when they could be to prevent the Russians from getting away with their guns. But they were outnumbered, and the Russians fought back hard. Cavalrymen who lost their horses had it the worst and were quickly surrounded and either taken prisoner or killed. Here, rank had its privileges. Officers were more likely to be taken prisoner than privates. After the front line broke through the guns, the regiments were broken up. Junior officers looked for their seniors, who should have been rounding up the troops and giving orders. Lord Cardigan had broke through the line first, ahead of the regiments and alone. His aides and trumpeters had been hit or lost their horses, and contact with Lieutenant Colonel Mayau was lost. Instead of stopping just past the guns, as the rest of the men did, Cardigan kept on going all the way through the smoke. He broke through the cloud and came face to face with the Russian cavalry. He barely escaped the lances of the Cossacks as they advanced on him. Retreating back into the smoke to escape the cavalry, Cardigan was spotted by a number of the British cavalry, but none went to him. They had more pressing matters at hand as the fighting intensified. After this, Cardigan would not be seen again or take part in any further action. It was believed he had abandoned the brigade and retreated early. In the absence of orders from senior officers, the men fell back to the one task that followed from a charge: capture the guns and take them back to the British lines. Gunners were cut down as they attempted to flee, and the British attempted to claim their guns. At this point, Colonel Mayau, not having seen or heard Cardigan, assumed command of the brigade. He called out for the men to gather on him. He had no trumpeter, and the men attempting to take the guns neither saw or heard him. Only 15 men from the 17th and 12 from the 13th answered his call. He led these men through the thinning smoke and spotted the waiting Russian cavalry. He knew what would happen if they retreated back up the valley and the havoc the Russian cavalry would reap. He did the only thing he knew to do. He began to form up his men, putting the lancers in the front rank. He led the charge of 27 men directly at the waiting Russian cavalry. They all knew if the Russians stood firm and the second line of regiments and the heavy brigade did not arrive for support, they were all dead. Surprisingly, the waiting Russian cavalry regiments did not hold firm. They turned and fled from Colonel Mayau's group. They chased the Russians back 500 yards, pushing them to the Chernaya River. Another group of survivors, led by Captain Morris, commanding officer of the 17th Lancers, missed the gun line completely and charged all the way through the smoke bank. When he finally stopped, on the other side of the smoke, only 20 men of his regiment stood behind him. In front of him stood a whole regiment of Russian hussars. Both groups stared at the other in shock. Captain Morris recovered first and called the charge. He led his 20 lancers straight at the Russian cavalry. The Russians broke and ran. During the melee, as the lancers charged into the Russians, Captain Morris would be wounded and unhorsed. He would eventually be taken prisoner by a Russian officer. The 11th Hussars, who had veered too far to the left, had also missed the guns and charged through the smoke. They ran into the same Russians who had just taken Captain Morris prisoner and cut down most of the remaining lancers. Colonel Douglas had only lost 50 men during the charge and stood with the surviving 80 men facing the Russians. Douglas, like the men before him, did the only thing he thought to do. They charged the Russians. Again, the Russians broke rank and fell back. Both Colonel Douglas's group and Colonel Mayau's group had pushed the Russians back to the Chernaya. The only thing holding the Russians back was the fear of the coming British support that had to be behind the British chasing them. The British all waited desperately for the second line to come, with the heavy brigade close behind them. The 4th Light Dragoons of the second line hit the battery in the center. The fighting there was still going on as the 4th joined the melee. They hit the surviving gunners hard. The gunners fought back viciously. and several British were killed or taken prisoner. While the fighting continued, Lord Paget decided the gunners had been beaten, and with the absence of the regiments in front of him, assumed they had continued on in pursuit of the Russians. He led the 4th Light Dragoons after them. Colonel Shewell and the 8th Hussars were the last to reach the guns. They had swung to the right and missed the battery. Those on the far left of the line made it in between the guns and engaged the few surviving gunners. All mounted survivors of the brigade were now behind the gun line. 3 groups had pushed the Russian cavalry back to the Chernaya. The 4th stood between them and the guns. They all waited for the arrival of the heavy brigade. The Russians halted their retreat and looked back. Realization of their superior numbers dawning as they saw no further support coming. They turned to face the British and slowly edged forward. The waiting grew intense until the Russian officers shouted out orders and the cavalry charged the remaining British. The British stood firm in the face of the Russians. The 11th Hussars held them off briefly, but were under threat of being surrounded. They were forced to fall back to the gun line, where they were joined by Lord Paget and the 4th. The Russians were content to follow, but not attack. On the right side of the valley, Colonel Mayow's group joined with the remainder of the 8th Hussars. They stood at a standstill, face to face with the Russians. Meanwhile, Russian Lancer regiments moved down from the heights. They now formed a line behind the British. The Light Brigade was trapped between the sabers of the cavalry in front of them and the lances behind them. The Russians smelled victory and knew the day was theirs. The men following Mayow and Shewell were the first to see they were trapped. Again, they refused to surrender, and a charge against the line of lancers facing them was called. They dashed at the enemy line. They swung their sabers and hacked their way through the thick cavalry line. The survivors of this charge raced through toward the British line. Off to the right side of the valley, the 11th Hussars and 4th Light Dragoons soon realized the peril they were in as the enemy lancers came closer. The enemy line swung out as if to take the coming cavalry in the side as they passed by. They slowed their advance to a trot before coming to a stop. The British passed them by, fully expecting to get hit. The Russians did nothing and let them pass. With both groups of survivors passing through, the Russians turned their attention to the few survivors left at the gun line. These scattered men eventually came together to form a third group. They formed up under Corporal Morley of the 17th Lancers. As both groups of Russians closed in on either side, he formed up the men. The Russians fully expected them to surrender. They did not. Morley called for a charge, and the survivors smashed into the center of the Russian lines and broke free. All the survivors of the Light Brigade still had a long way to get back to the British lines and relative safety. They would have to fight their way back and make it past the guns on the Causeway Heights. Many of the survivors would not make it back, but some would. Those walking would face the gravest danger, as they were easy picking for the Cossacks looting the dead and wounded. Some of the British would stop and help the wounded when they could. They did their best to get as many men back across the lines. A few were able to catch riderless horses to use to make it back. Others, not so lucky, had to walk. Those still on horses quickly overcame the walking wounded as they traveled back up the valley. They were still clustered together and were easy targets when the guns on the Causeway Heights opened back up. Some of the men would quickly spread out to increase their chances of making it past the guns. A few passing too close to the heights drew the fire of the Russian infantry. Corporal Morley's group would get close enough to the heights, they went partially up the lower slope when they ran into a group of infantry. The infantry opened up and cut down most of the group. They were soon surrounded and the survivors taken prisoner. They would be marched back to the gun line where they joined with the other men that had been taken prisoner. By this time, mounted survivors were back across the British line as the rest came straggling in. The survivors formed up on the spot where they had started out from. As the last mounted man took his place, roll was called. The roll was called to determine how many men were still mounted and fit for duty. The whole charge and retreat took no more than 20 minutes. And out of the roughly 670 men that had started the advance, only 195 were still mounted. The men still on foot, either wounded or helping the wounded, were still straggling back up the valley. As they got closer, men were sent out to help them back across the lines. The wounded would go to the doctors. Those without horses went back to camp. The men were both happy and angry when they got back across the British line. The question on everyone's lips, where was the Heavy Brigade? And with the Light Brigade back safely behind British lines, that is where we are going to end today's show. Next week, we'll get into the aftermath of the charge and the end of the Crimean War. Thanks for listening, and as always, if you like the show, please consider leaving a rating or review on your app of choice, or reach out to the show at historiesadisaster@gmail.com, or through social media. Facebook and Instagram links are in the show notes. And you can always share the episode, because sharing is caring, and if there was more caring in the world, maybe history wouldn't be a disaster. Thanks and goodbye.